as we go through this, if you do have questions, you can feel free to enter those in as questions as we go, and we'll have a time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please don't be shy to ask questions as we go here. So our topic today, the role of personalized messaging in patient care. So Chris and I have been doing quite a bit of work on this in recent months, looking at what differences are made with the practices that we work with when we get more personalized in our messaging with them, in the communication that we have with patients. Does it make a difference? Does it not make a difference? So that's going to be what we are going to cover today. As far as who I am, so I am Joey Wickham. I'm the senior account manager here at Vital Interaction. I just actually celebrated my 3-year here at Vital Interaction. So I've learned, I'm sure, as anybody in the healthcare world knows, a ton in those 3 years, and continue to learn a lot. I have the advantage of being able to work with, like, one-on-one with a lot of our customers at Vital Interaction, a lot of healthcare practices around the States, different specialties. And so I'm really excited today because I think with some of the case studies that Chris has done, and some of the data that we've been able to look at working with these practices, I think we have a really strong hold to hopefully help some healthcare practices as we go here. So Chris, I'll let you give an intro and then we can dive in.
Well, yeah, congrats on the 3 years, Joey. I can't believe it seems like yesterday when you joined, right into the thick of things with COVID. And I think we learned a lot through that, and we'll talk about personalization in messaging. But yeah, I'm Chris Gowell, product manager here at Vital Interaction. I've had the pleasure of working at VI now for just over 6 years, and I've worked in various departments from support to now kind of taken on more of a role as product manager. And it's really been interesting to work on these case studies with you, Joey, and work with our customers to help them sort of thrive in the messages that we essentially deliver.
For sure. So on that note, agenda for today. So the first thing, what Chris and I wanted to start with was around what is personalization in general. Something that I've learned in just my 3 years working at Vital Interaction, is that every healthcare practice seems to have different terminology for different things. And so I want to make sure that we're on the same page. So we're going to look at some data and stats around personalization in general in the healthcare world. What does that look like? What does it mean? What's the value in that? And then specifically, just because the healthcare world, again, is vast, we're going to be really diving in on a specific subset of that personalization. So as the webinar name suggests, specifically in like the messaging portion to patients, because there's personalization throughout the entire experience. But if we're focusing on one of them, and that's what we've done our case studies on, what does that look like? So we'll go through those two things, and then we'll have a time, as I mentioned, for Q&A at the end. So please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat or ask them as we go, and then we'll get to them at the end as well. Chris, anything to add to agenda before we go?
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate with the questions, because we at VI work with many different types of practices. So I'm eager to learn, from the attendees, from their experience in personalization. And I think at the end of the day, how we work with different practices is very much a partnership. So I think, yeah, I'm just excited to see what comes of this.
Yeah, 100%. All right, what is personalization? So when you think about what personalization is, so we can go to the next slide here. So it's kind of divided into 3 different sections here. So you see there, personalized healthcare, personalized medicine, precision medicine. A lot of what we're going to be focusing on is probably this first section here. So the delivery of medical services from diagnosis all the way through recovery. So there's different aspects that are going to be involved from the beginning of when you first meet a patient, they first schedule an appointment, all the way through their care at the appointment, the after treatment from the appointment, maybe scheduling follow-ups. So that's going to be the large majority of what we focus on today. But also included in personalization, which I mean, maybe we'll briefly discuss, is also just like, okay, what does it look like in the personalization of the doctor and patient interactions when they're talking to each other? What does that personalization look like? I mean, we're now in the days where you can have an appointment with the doctor over a phone, right? So it's like, what does personalization look like in those aspects? And then the last one there is like specific tools that are actually being used in that personalization aspect. So again, we're going to be mainly focusing on this first one of what does the delivery of medical services look like from the beginning of service all the way through the recovery of service. And that also looks different depending on specialty even as well, right? So we've worked with eye care practices, we've worked with behavioral health groups, we've worked with dermatology groups. Everybody has a little bit of a different system in place. And so we'll go over some of that as we go through some of these stats. Chris, anything again to add?
Yeah, I was going to mention with, obviously, we talk about personalization a lot, but with the age of the EMR and sort of the mandatory requirement to patients to have access to their healthcare data, I think there's a beauty in that. From our perspective at VI, having access to patient data allows us to deliver messages in a more personalized way as well. So just having access to appointment data, CPT and ICD codes. Again, and we'll talk about this, that there's one thing to deliver a message, but what does that message look like? When is it delivered? At what time? What's the response rate to those messages as well?
Yeah, I feel like that ties directly into that quote on the next slide, if you want to read that one, Chris.
Yeah. So, I'll just read this out. From patient portals to telehealth to precision medicine, there are numerous ways healthcare personalization is moving from novel to normal. And again, I think I'd like to reiterate the fact that the age of interoperability, patients having access to their healthcare data, and us at VI having access to data, I think it is becoming normal to expect it sort of telehealth patient portals and things like that. Just how can we better deliver healthcare messages to patients, and even from not only to remind patients of their appointment, but what about education before and after appointments as well?
Yeah, and it makes me think of even just the history of healthcare. I mean, I remember when my doctor switched from all paper records to switching over to digital records. And I think if you think about it, there was kind of a gap when all of that happened. It's like originally it was like, oh, I got a call from my doctor or a nurse, and they were telling me about my appointment or trying to get me to come back in. And I, for a while it was like, okay, everything switched over to digital. You're not getting calls anymore. Maybe it's like an automated message. And so I think that there was a gap in services for a bit where healthcare was like very unpersonal. It was like, hey, you're just kind of a number in this big wheel, and we got to get you in for your appointment. But I think what's exciting now is the same technology that took away some of the personalization, I think is going to start helping to bring more and more personalization back. You already mentioned, but like with CPT and ICD codes, we're able to, like, you're now able to look at those kinds of things and get really specific information to patients, which is some of what we'll go over in the case studies as well. But you're able to get even more specific information to patients so that so that you really are personalizing the outreach to them, which is something that maybe 10 years ago you had maybe the disadvantage of, oh, everything is through technology and digital now and it's not as personal, but you didn't have the advantage of, hey, we can get really specific with this messaging to the point where it's more personal for them as well.
Yeah, and I think even just the ability to follow and be more easily follow patients through their healthcare journey as well. I think that becomes important too.
Yeah. So I think with that in mind, thinking through what is the advantage with all this. Basically, I was looking at some stats around what is the market. I mean, the healthcare market in the US, it's the largest market in the US, right? So there's a lot to be gained here. So I was looking, and basically in at the end of 2021, the personalized medicine market was, I believe, estimated at like 512 billion, and already by 2028 it's estimated to be at almost 800 billion. And so I guess what I think of with that is like, I mean, there's big players that are starting to get involved. You have Google and IBM that are starting to get involved with more of the personalized medicine market. And so I think there's a huge market to tap into here. And so I think if you can be on the cutting edge with technology, and there's a balance there with that. As I've talked to numerous practices, there's a balance of figuring out what your patient base desires, because there's some people who just don't desire as much of the like the digital side of things, but a lot of the market is shifting more in that direction. So I think if we, as healthcare practices, if you can start to cater to the needs of patients and also to keep up with technology, I think you will be at the cutting edge of, year after year, what's happening on the technology side of things. Because if you never change, right, then eventually you're gonna lag behind the rest of other healthcare practices who are taking advantage of technology. So again, there's big players that are starting to get involved with this, and there's a huge market to tap into. So I think if you can balance the act of starting to use more and more technology to help with automation, to help with personalization, then you'll be able to continue running as a practice through the times that many other practices may not be able to.
Yeah, and I was going to mention this number wouldn't continue to increase if patients weren't scheduling appointments on a regular basis, right? So I think, it's not so much wrong is the wrong word, but at the end of the day, healthcare practices are running a business, but ultimately the patient care is the most important thing. So I think the higher this value goes up means patients are starting to take care of their own health as well. And I think personalization has a very big say in that too. And
Yeah,
I think that's where, as a company, we help our customers.
yeah, that is super huge, because I think about like, obviously, as we go through stats and profits and all that, it's like, oh, how can you be the most successful practice? But I think at the end of the day, it's, hey, how can we help patients get the care that they need? Because that's why we're doing the things that we're doing, right? Like I recently did an interview with the staff, like interviews with different staff members at Vital Interaction, and almost every single person said, hey, basically we like working at Vital Interaction because we're able to have an impact on the end result of, hey, people need to be cared for in terms of the healthcare world, and we're able to make a difference on that. We're not just like a company that's not, I guess, not like having an end result of really helping people, but that's the same reason that these healthcare, that you at a healthcare practice are doing this as well. We're helping the end result for the patient needs. So here's some more stats as we get into it. So as we're researching more and more of this, getting the baseline for personalization, so you see here, almost 50% of patients express interest in engaging with providers digitally. So, I mean, again, a personal example here, my wife recently, basically, like her insurance covered her to be able to do more telehealth visits. And now that's like the only thing that she likes to do. Like she doesn't want to have to go in if she can just do a telehealth visit. So that's a personal example, but clearly here, 50% of patients, they're interested in some shape or form interacting with providers digitally. So I think this statistic flies in the face of a lot of us who may think like, oh, people still want like personal interactions in person with their providers. That is still a desire, obviously, but people are also desiring to communicate with their providers digitally as well. But then the 44% here, so 44% expect healthcare providers and brands to proactively contact them at the right time in the right context. So what I see here is basically people want to be communicated with digitally, or communicating digitally with their providers, but they also want the right information. They want it in the right context. They want it at the right time. Like people don't enjoy just getting random things from their provider digitally that they've got to put extra research in to even figure out what it's saying. But if it has the right information and it has it in the right context, that's when it becomes more and more valuable for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always say this, and sometimes maybe it shoots us in the foot, but I think while we are an automation company, I don't think you can ever replace the human interaction as well, face to face. And I think that's by adding an element of automation to patients' healthcare, it allows providers more time to actually care for their patients face to face as well. Even though there is telehealth and there's many scenarios now where telehealth is reimbursable, but I also think saving time and as you can see here, almost half of patients expect to be have that digital element,
Yep.
I also think there's sort of a sweet spot between the two of face-to-face and sort of digital communication as well. So
Yeah.
interested to dive into some of those case studies too.
Yeah, it makes me think about like just the visits that I have with my doctor. I I was telling my wife this the other day, but it's like I haven't seen my doctor in a year, and I go back in, and he remembers things about me that I like barely remember ever telling him, and yet he's like, oh, like how's this, how's this. So I think a lot of doctors are very skilled at having that personal touch of like when you go into a doctor, they actually remember things about you. I mean, maybe they're taking notes, but who knows? But they remember that personalized. So I think when you take that personalization in office, which is really important to patients of like, man, my doctor actually knows me and cares about me. And then turn that into also the messaging before the appointment is personalized, the messaging after the appointment is personalized, like getting them to the appointment is personalized. It completes the experience of, it's not just like, oh, like I'm a number and then I go in and now my doctor cares about me and then I'm a number again.
Exactly. Yep.
So more stats here, and I'll just cover this briefly because I really want to get into the meat and potatoes of what we've seen at Vital Interaction on the messaging side. But this just goes along more with what we were just talking about. So 66% of consumers, basically it says that they would choose a provider based on their ability to communicate with them. And so, I mean, that goes along with what we're saying. They not only do people appreciate that, but they're actually choosing their providers based off of their ability to communicate with them at the right time in the right context. 60% critical for them to understand them as well. So that goes with not just sending random information, but specific information that's relevant for them. But the big kicker here for me is 75% of US consumers wish their healthcare experiences were more personalized. So, I mean, I think this is where the rubber meets the road for me. It's like 75% of patients are desiring a more personal like experience with their healthcare. And so what are we doing? And this is really what's driven the case studies, I think, on the Vital Interaction side of how can we make something that seemed like it was just like an operational thing into a more personal approach. And I think we've seen that goes along with this statistic that patients are appreciating that and they're reacting to it.
Yeah, definitely. And again, we'll go into the case studies here in a sec. But there's one thing to deliver a message, but I think what we've really sort of deep dove into is how is that message delivered and when. So excited to go through that here.
Cool. Well, let's go into the case studies. So,
Yeah.
so this is one aspect of where it comes into play, how it works, right? Is the messaging in the how do we personalize messaging in the patient experience? So the first thing that I wanted to like talk through is thinking of what are even the communication methods that are available. Because I think you need to start with the like the what before you can get into the how and the why and all that. And so historically, if you need to communicate with a patient, 9 times out of 10, that's picking up the phone and calling them, right? Some practices that I've worked with, maybe it was, hey, if we need to get them back in, then we had our postcard that we put in our file cabinet. And then when it was time to see the patient, then we took out the postcards for May and we sent those out, put stamps on them. In general, a lot of manual process there, either picking up the phone, sending out postcards. So now thinking through what are the opportunities now? So there's still phone call. Oftentimes that can be automated. There's emails, there's text messaging. Now also media is a lot of video. So there's a lot of video that's being used. And so some of the case studies will dive into how you can use video in that personalized effort to reach out to patients. Because if patients / people in general are consuming media a lot of times through video, then why don't we try and do more of that in how we're reaching out to them in personalization for the outreach for appointments as well.
Yeah, wasn't that long ago we used carrier pigeons when you think of history. That's a joke, but it's kind of true as well. But
yeah,
it's amazing how fast the industry is moving and continues to.
Yep.
Yeah, and this is. Oh, sorry, Joe. Did you?
Oh no, I was just
just
gonna say, yeah,
gonna
I mean, like so I was just gonna mention, like, basically Chris is really like, I've worked with a lot of the practices. Chris has done a lot of the data crunching behind the case studies that we've done here. And so Chris is gonna dive into the case studies here, and we'll go through some of what we've learned.
Yeah, so at VI, we deliver messages. So essentially, we integrate with EMRs, and that gives us access to the schedule, right? And it's almost a given now that most practices typically use some kind of automated system to remind their patients of appointments, and even recalls and reactivations, which we'll get into. But what I wanted to do is look at, okay, there's one thing to deliver a message, again, as I mentioned, but how is that delivered? So typically at VI, we can deliver an automated voice call if the patient has that as a preference in the EMR. But then we started to look at, well, if I receive a phone call, to be honest, I'm probably not going to answer it if I don't know who it's coming from. And I think that's pretty commonplace. But so, we wanted to look at what happens if you pick up the phone and it says your sort of practice name on it, but what happens if the actual doctor is at the end of that recording? And so we did a case study where we looked at sort of an A/B test to where, let's use a normal automated phone call versus a provider actually on the end of the phone call. So let's say, for example, a patient hasn't been seen for an appointment in a year, and you need to get those patients back in for their annual eye check. And so we looked at the difference between the provider recording the actual message versus just a normal standard message. And we found patients were 3 times more likely to answer the phone if it has the practice ID and the provider actually listening, actually recording the message, which is awesome. So, and I think that's a cool touch. And this was one of the ideas we had from one of our customers that we work with, Joey, where it's like, I think that was a brilliant idea to actually do that. But so then we thought, okay, what about patient educational videos in the middle here? You'll see, so patients who have a cataract consultation, we wanted to look at actually adding a video before their appointment as more of a preparation before the appointment. And then we looked at, and I'll go into that case study here in a sec, but then we looked at the amount of link clicks. So, hey, looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for your appointment. Please click on this link to be prepared for your appointment and what to expect before and after. And now we're looking at embedding videos, providers actually recording their own message before certain appointment types, such as cataract. And then you can think of these case studies being even after a surgery, or but in this case, it's mostly the cataract appointment evaluation types. And I think now we're looking at phone calls, text messages, and emails, and how we can personalize that messaging to the patients. And it was great to work with a lot of customers, wasn't it, Joey, on that?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that I was just thinking about, you mentioned this, is like, so many of our ideas come from the healthcare practices that we work with. They have, one person on staff is like, is there any way that we could do this? And we say, well, I don't know, like, let's check it out, let's see. And so I think like all of these ideas have come from those healthcare practices, and then we've been able to implement them on the technology side. And the other thing that I think has struck me as well as we've done this, because I didn't do a lot of marketing stuff before being at Vital Interaction, but realizing what little changes you can make that make huge differences, where it's like, oh, like when you look from the outside perspective, it's like, well, whether a call comes from, a computer generated voice or a nurse or a doctor probably doesn't make a big difference, right? But then when we actually went out and we had providers record a message and send that out as part of like the reminder, like the results went way up, like way more than you think they would. And so that's been something cool, is just the ideas that have come from our healthcare practices that we work with, and two, the little changes that we've been able to make that make huge differences at practices. And it's honestly not oftentimes a huge lift for them either. It's just putting in a little extra work to make big returns in the long run.
Yeah, and it's so nice to compare the before and after of these studies as well.
Yeah. So I was, so we're going to dive into like 1, 2, 3, 4, each of these case studies. So wanted to give just a brief outline here. So we already went over like 2 kind of aspects of this personalized approach, but the areas that we've seen, and there are probably more, we're continuing to learn more from the practices that we work with, what things could be helpful. But these are the 4 areas that we've really seen big levels of improvement through personalization. So one is that pre-appointment care. So some of what we're just looking at, hey, what if you put a video of a doctor with information about upcoming surgery or something like that? Show rates have gone way up, which goes into the number 2, reducing no-shows by giving more specific information so they're less trepidatious about coming in for their appointment. The third one there, post-appointment care. So, hey, what if we put some sort of follow-up text in there asking how their visit was, are they feeling okay? Asking them to give feedback to us if they need to. So giving more personalization for them in that post-appointment care. And the fourth one, which I think maybe is the biggest bang for your buck or the biggest return, is around reactivation. So, hey, what if you had a provider record a message that you sent out to patients who haven't been back in for a year or something that says, hey, we really care about your health. I haven't seen you in this amount of time. Would love to get you back in for an appointment, something like that. Again, just a little bit of personalization goes a huge way. So these are 4 of the big use cases that we've seen so far in some of this personalization, and I'll let Chris take it away again with the individual case studies that we've done around some of these different use cases.
Yeah, let's dive into them. And I touched on this in one of the previous slides in pre-appointment care. And again, it's amazing how many ideas our customers have, but it's super cool. So again, this was an ophthalmology practice that used BI tools to communicate before a cataract evaluation. And so there's a video that we can embed in the messages, in the emails, and a link in text messages. And the first iteration, we tried it out with just certain providers or locations. And what I really wanted to look at is how many patients clicked on the link. And I was amazed to see even the first iteration was 50%. And at this stage, we were only delivering the messages 5 days before the appointment. And then because of the success of this, then we expanded it to all of the providers that had that specific appointment type, because we know, as I mentioned, because we know the provider's schedule, we'll know, okay, this patient has this appointment in 5 days' time. Let's start sending the messages to be prepared for the appointment. But then we thought, I honestly thought that we could do better. So then now we delivered the message, say 24 hours before the appointment, just when, if the appointment is tomorrow, I'm less likely to no-show if I deliver a message with the embedded video. And so just that slight tweak increased it by, as you can see, 60% of the links clicked. And I think that's a telling thing in looking at not only delivering a message, but what's the likelihood of a patient not only attending the appointment, but clicking on the link, depending on how and when we actually deliver the message. And I think that was a very telling statistic there.
Yeah.
And then
huge. I was just gonna say, like,
sorry,
it's just fascinating to me, like how each of those little pieces go into the end result. It's like how many people got it, how many people are clicking the link, how many people are going through the link, how many people are watching it. All of that, which you might think of as just like silly little data pieces, contribute to the long-term goal of people showing up for their appointment, for people actually clicking links and understanding about their appointment. So don't mean to sidetrack, but it's very fascinating to me how all of that ties together.
No, it is. And I think just being able to monitor it, I've become a bit of a dork lately with sort of looking at different statistics. And, I think there's one thing to deliver that message, but what's the cause and effect of that message? And from there, we looked at, okay, again, we can look at 60% of the patients clicking on the link. That's great. But how does that correlate to no-show rates as well for this specific appointment type? So what we learned was, I think we hit the sweet spot, before we were delivering these embedded videos, the average no-show rate over the same correlated time frame of around a month's worth of data was 8.56% no-show rate. But once we started delivering the message in a more personalized way, we reduced the no-show rate for that specific appointment type by 45%. So I think as we gather more data across more industries, more practices, it could be ophthalmology, eye care, pain management. Clearly, the content of the message is having a huge impact on patients actually showing up to the appointment and ultimately improving their care and improving the bottom line for the practices as well.
That number is so huge to me.
Yeah.
like going from 8.56 to 4.7 in no-show rate. I mean, again, it like looks small, but man, you have 45% decrease in no-shows. That's a lot more potential money in the door now for the practice and patients who are getting the care they need too, right?
Yeah. I had to look at that statistic several times to make sure it was correct, but it is. So yeah.
Crazy. So on the post-appointment engagement, so a lot of this one is honestly, it kind of is between post-appointment and also already kind of getting into the reactivations. Because I think of post-appointment might be more of your surveys that you send afterwards, or as I mentioned, like a text to a patient after they came in for their appointment. But this is already kind of even getting into the reactivation piece of things, where it's what I think of as like you really don't have much to lose, right? So if with this case study, I don't remember exactly which practice this was, but the idea of we sent out 3,766 messages to patients that, for whatever reason, didn't come in for their appointment. And I'll let Chris dive into more of like some of the use cases, because I know some of these were like no-show appointments, some of them were annual reactivations or CPT, ICD. But basically, the end result is there were 3,766 messages sent to patients that for whatever reason didn't schedule an appointment. Out of those 3,766, 321 appointments were booked. So that means that, like, again, I just feel like there's not a lot to lose here, because if these patients weren't going to schedule on their own, then 321 of them did schedule. That's a huge chunk of money. Like if you think, oftentimes what I do is think through, hey, how much is one appointment worth? And that's not even looking at the long-term value of keeping a patient rather than trying to acquire a new patient, right? But even just thinking of like, what is one appointment worth? If reimbursement rate on an appointment is worth, $80, or maybe it's like $300 or something like that, then if you look at this 321 appointments booked, then that's a huge amount of money that is gained and really not a lot to lose. So 20% in schedule, 20% increase in schedule appointments for this practice. I mean, maybe for your practice, if you've got a smaller amount of doctors, or if you have way more doctors, then think about what a 20% increase in schedule appointments would look like for your practice. I mean, that's a huge amount of increase in appointments. So I know, Chris, this was, I don't know if you can dive more into, I think this was a combination of like different kinds of campaigns, like no shows, annuals, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So when this all started when we were working together, Joey, at the very beginning, closely with customers, when practices were reopening after COVID-19, and looking at patients that should have come back after not having their eyes checked for a year, for example, or just an annual well check. And I think you made a good point in it's very much low hanging fruit. But the way that we did this was look at, okay, a practice needs to increase their appointment volume. Let's use our smart list engine to look at all patients that had an appointment 1 year ago, and then subtract any patients from that list that have been back since or have a future appointment. And then we can look at this more sort of granularly with CPT ICD codes. Certain patients, maybe there's diagnosis codes such as diabetic retinopathy, for example, certain subsets of patients that you can really target to come back. And I think that falls into what we were mentioning in following a patient through their healthcare journey. I mean, if I didn't get a reminder for my annual well check, I probably wouldn't get one, to be honest. But and I think that this is a huge benefit. But yeah, in terms of use cases, there's annuals, there's certain CPT ICD codes. Maybe certain patients need to be seen every 3 months. If a patient misses their appointment or cancels, I think it's all about patient retention and actually reducing the patient slippage as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of, what do you have to lose? It's like you have, clearly we see right here, you have a lot to gain potentially, but what do you have to lose? If you're not reaching out to any of these patients, think about what you're potentially losing by not reaching out to them. You know, at least if you reach out to them, maybe the likelihood that at least some will schedule is very, very high. So you really don't have a lot to lose there.
Yeah, and as we go over this final case study here, this kind of feeds off of the last slide that we talked about. Was okay, there's one thing to know what patients need to come back after 1 year, but how do we deliver that message? Do we personalize it? Do we embed videos? Do we have certain providers record the voice? So here what we did in a similar fashion is we, in round one that you'll see here, we looked at all patients that had an appointment but didn't schedule a follow-up. And we just used a voice call of a generic recording. And, that was still very successful, honestly. But then we looked at, okay, we need to improve the numbers a little bit more. So let's have the providers record the message and also send a text message as well, like it's from the provider.
Yeah.
And then you can see here, we jumped up greatly in the success. And this was one of the first times we did this with the provider recorded voice calls, if you remember, Joey,
Yeah.
And it became very popular, and we did it for over 40 providers for the actual voice recorded messages. And it was really cool to see the appointment volume actually increase the more providers that signed up for actually recording a message. And again, like you mentioned earlier, it didn't take, it wasn't a huge lift to get providers to sign up to record the messages as well.
Yeah, I think it was like, it's one of those things where it was like, if I remember right, like some providers did it and it was just kind of a beta trial, and then it was super successful. So then all of a sudden it was like, oh, all these other providers now also want to do this because it's not a huge lift and there's a lot to be gained from it.
Yeah, and you can see the difference in appointment volume between the two subsets of data as well. And then finally here in rank 3, what we did was provided voice, text, and email because obviously not everyone has a home phone these days. So what if we did text and email in a certain kind of cadence? So first it would be, let's start off with a phone call, and then we'll know if the patient didn't pick up the phone call or didn't schedule, then we can follow up with a text or email after that. Mm-hmm. So now we're starting to look at what's the sweet spot between cadences for certain patient, for actual practices to schedule an appointment. What's the likelihood of patient scheduling, depending on the cadence that we actually set. And this practice over 3 months increased the appointment volume by 18%, which was huge.
Wow.
And now it's sort of in an automated fashion where it's constantly running in the background as well.
Yeah. Well, and that was what I was just thinking of, is we already talked about, it's not that big of a lift, but especially like once you've already done it, then like at least what we've done on the vital action side is it's just automated. It's always going on. It's always happening in the background. And so you're literally generating appointments by not doing any work, like, except for maybe like you're receiving the calls from patients trying to schedule. But I would say that's still a worthy work to do, is to just have to field inbound calls of people wanting to schedule appointments. So very, very low hanging fruit here.
Yeah, and hope we can work with a lot more practices as we continue to sort of refine our product.
Yeah, which I think brings us to the Q&A section. I know I've gotten a few messages as we've gone here with questions, but if you do have questions, please feel free to either enter them in the Q&A section, or I don't know if there's a comment section on here, but yeah, feel free to enter those in the Q&A. Let me look at my messages I got here while I went, and we can answer some of those. All right, so here was a question. You noticed a difference in personalization between specialties. So I can talk briefly, Chris. You can probably give more insight to this. As far as difference between specialties, I would say definitely, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we work with everything from eye care practices to behavioral health, urology. Every practice is a little different. We found, for example, like with some of the behavioral health, it's much more nuanced in terms of how personal you can be. Whereas with the eye practices, and these are just two examples that I'm giving, it's been, you can be much more specific in some of the in the messaging that you're giving to them. Like we gave the example of the cataract evaluation and getting specific messaging for that. So I think you can get more specific in some of those. I don't know, Chris, if you have other thoughts on like the difference in specialties of what we've seen.
Yeah, I think they're all successful. It doesn't matter what specialty, but what we're seeing is when the message is delivered is key, depending on specialty. So with behavioral health, I think it's important to follow up on a more regular basis. Whereas eye care, it's less. That's sort of the wrong word, but I think the cadence of messaging becomes more important depending on the specialty. But
Yep.
and then of course I think pain management as well has been very successful.
Yeah. And I think what I would say is we're continuing to learn. I mean,
Yeah.
as we have individual case studies in different, I would say not only specialties, but also in different regions of the US, it's different. We have practices that are out in the Northeast part of the United States, and it seems patients react much differently from messaging there than they do from the deep South. And so as we continue to add more and more case studies and learn more about each specialty, each region, even different kinds of practices and how they run, I think that we've learned a lot from that. And the cool thing is we're able to iterate on what we've done, where we do an A/B test and we figure out, hey, what works well with this, what doesn't. Let's change it up a little bit. Does that work better? Does that work worse? So I think we've seen a lot of success from that.
Yeah, just real quick on that. I'm working with a practice in Arizona at the moment to try and keep the appointment volume consistent because it's snowbird season where it's extremely hot in Arizona. And that's pretty easy for a British guy to say that it's hot everywhere. But patients and many people travel a lot. So when certain patients move out of town, maybe to a cooler climate, it becomes very key to keep the consistency of the appointment volume as well.
Yeah. All right. I have some other questions here. All right. So most of our patients don't have email. What would you recommend for personalizing outreach to them? So I think we've definitely dealt with this, both with on the email side. Some of them are like, hey, our patients are very elderly and don't have text or email. I think that's pretty rare at this point. But I would say what we've learned is just use what you have. On the phone call side, we're able to personalize it by having the provider recorded voice. On the email side, if that's what you do have, then put videos in the emails. We've started where you can actually even put like videos in text as well, like especially on iPhones. Oftentimes videos will unfurl on the message so that you can click into them. So I don't know if you have more to add to that, Chris, but I would say it's like it's okay if you don't have a lot of this kind of thing on file for your patients. Just use what you do have and try and make that as personal as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Voice, text, or email, I think any one of those or all three, depending on the patient preference that's set into the EMR or as well. But
yeah. Got a couple more questions here. Oh man, this is kind of a hard one. Where do you think personalization may go in the future? Man, Chris, I don't know if you want to answer that one first.
yeah, I'm kind of old and grumpy these days, but even emojis, to be honest, it's amazing how everything's moved on. But I think personalization is what I've seen is definitely moving towards more video content. And that's just what I'm seeing. I think just a huge advance in video content instead of sort of long-winded emails that can be replaced with a video.
Yeah, I've noticed that it's like, I mean, I've noticed that on even social media at this point, everything is videos. And I think we're probably just going in the direction that more and more stuff will be done over video, where it's like, instead of reading an email with instructions, you'll watch a 30-second video with the instructions instead. So I can definitely see that becoming more and more prevalent in the soon the soon future. All right, I have one other question here. Can you do any personalization based off specific procedures or diagnosis for patients? So yeah, so we talked briefly about this, but around like CPT and ICD codes. So that's one of the huge advantages that we found in personalization, is whether it's using stuff like, hey, what appointment type did they have, or diving even deeper into what kind of procedures or diagnosis does this patient have. You open up the door possibility hugely to being able to really being able to address what a patient needs. And obviously you have to be careful in the messaging that you're sending out with that, so you're not violating any HIPAA laws, which obviously we've done very well. But yeah, I think those things, being able to use procedure and diagnosis for patients in the messaging, and being able to create, hey, we want to send this kind of a message to the patients with this procedure. I mean, that helps a ton in the reception of the messages that are going out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's actually, I think more personalized messages based on procedures or diagnosis codes will become almost essential soon.
Yep. All right. Let's see. I don't have any other questions, I don't think, here. So if you do have other questions or want to learn more about personalization, honestly, I say this oftentimes at the end of some of the webinars we do, but I think it can sometimes be daunting of like, where do I even start? Like, you talked about a lot of stuff, different case studies. Of course, we're happy to help whenever we can, if we can help a practice. But at the same time, what I often tell people is just like, pick one thing and start with that. If it's, hey, we want to try and make our outreach to patients more personal, look at what you're doing now and try and just implement one thing that's going to help it to be more personalized. If we can't work with you, then obviously, we would have suggestions around like, hey, what are you doing now? Let's implement this from what we've learned before. But I would say, if you want to start doing it on your own, just look at one thing and see, how can I change this, make this a little bit more personal, and go from there. So those are my parting words. Chris, any parting words from you?
No, it's been a pleasure to go through this today. And again, if there's any questions or anyone needs any help, we're always here to help. I think our ultimate goal is to help the healthcare industry in general.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all for attending.